Evil regimes attempt to crush David McBride will backfire. And yellow peril in the Yellow Sea. Coming up on this week's episode of the Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report. It's the 16th of May 2024. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by Citizens Party researcher and editor Richard Bardon. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Robbie.
In this week's show, we're going to talk about what happened this week, a day of shame when the Supreme Court of the ACT sentenced whistleblower David McBride to a crushingly lengthy prison sentence, and I'll explain why I'm calling it crushingly lengthy. It's 68 months, 5 years and 8 months. But in the context, that was actually a real blow. It's an attempt to crush the guy. It's not going to work. And once again, when there's something where we need the details, where the details are important, I get Richard on to say, Richard, give us the details. So we've had all this flap about what happened between the Australian helicopter and a Chinese jet in the Yellow Sea. What you need to know about it, which you're not getting from the media. But first, remember, help us get this message around. Like the show, share it on social media, subscribe if you're not a subscriber, and remember to ring the bell icon when you do. Comment below. The comments are very important. I actually do read them and try and comment and participate and respond when I can. And please donate to the cause. We are fighting very hard on multiple fronts here, and they've kind of all come together at once, actually, which I'll talk about in a minute. So any support that you can give us is greatly appreciated. Now, just a few updates before we get into the main topics, and why I said it's all coming together at once. So this week and next week, a lot of big things are happening. It started off on Tuesday with the sentencing of David McBride, which I went to Canberra for, and we're going to do a whole report on that, so we'll get to that in a minute. Today is the day, the official end of the Senate Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee inquiry into bank closures in regional Australia. The report is handed down today. Now, because we have to shoot a show and we edit it, we have to do it Thursday morning, so we can't really, sometimes these reports get delayed and not released until 5 o'clock or whatever, so we would really love to know what's in that report now. We don't. We will start notifying people as soon as we do know, so look out for releases from us on that front, etc. But this is something that we have monitored we are responsible for it. For 15 months we've been on this case, and whatever comes out of this report will be a platform for the next part of our campaign to bring back public banking in Australia. And I'm going to come back to this. I just want to mention, in terms of all these things coming together at once, on the 20th, next week, Julian Assange's next hearing is on at the court, at the UK Courts of Justice. And that's their response to the Americans' assurances. So I know Julian Assange's father, John Shipton, who I spent time with on Tuesday at the David McBride trial sentencing. I know he's on his way over there for that. And then a couple of days later, on the 24th, Dan Duggan, the former American Aussie Top Gun, will face his main extradition hearing as well. And we're going to have a lot more to say about that in coming days. In fact, after this show, I'm going to record a show specifically about Dan Duggan. And in fact, by the time this show gets posted, maybe we can have a link to that producer. There you go. Real-time communications here. We're making decisions on the fly. We can't give the details on this show now, except to say there's a new dimension that's emerged in this case of Dan Duggan, which puts it in the category of all these others. These are all people of the victims of the evil regime. But we'll come back to what that is in a minute. I'll have more to say about Dan Duggan at the end as well. Tune in on that. Just before we go on though, back to the bank issue. We know, whatever comes out of this report, Richard, I mean, I hope there's some strong stuff. The problem with this Parliament, they can come up with some strong recommendations along the lines of real regulation, because the banks are self-regulated. But what we have achieved in the 15 months of this inquiry is certainly behaviour modification by the banks, but we haven't changed their nature. And the proof of that, I want to play a little video, is what CBA did last week in Bardon, in the Sunshine Coast. And what they did is they've announced the closure of the Bardon branch, totally in breach of their promise, which they made in July last year to the inquiry that they won't close regional branches for 3 years. And this got a lot of good publicity for CBA. So why are they closing the Bardon branch, which is on the Sunshine Coast? Well, they found an index that the Australian Bureau of Statistics uses that says Sunshine Coast is no longer regional. Even though their own internal index that they use as part of the CBA funds this thing called the Regional Australia Institute, which has a regional movers index. And that index still calls Sunshine Coast regional. So this is cherry picking to create a loophole to get around their own promise, right? And that's what they will do to whatever regulations get recommended from this inquiry report. That's why the only way to really make these banks change their behaviour properly is force them to compete with a public bank, where they start to live in fear that they will lose customers if they don't lift their game properly and actually go out of their way to serve their customers where they are and how they need to be served. So with that said, Sunshine Coast Channel 7 actually reported this last week when we put out a pretty hard-hitting statement on it, and they got me on to interview me for their quick report. So have a look at this clip from, this was aired on Monday night this week on Channel 7 on the Sunshine Coast.
Gates down, posters up as another regional branch shuts.
Commonwealth Bank has broken its promise to the people of Bardon to keep its branch open.
But the bank claims to have done no such thing. Despite sitting in the heart of a regional shire, an index released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics insists the coast is now a major city.
By citing an index that assumes the people of Bardon have more services than other regional areas, they're using it as an excuse to take away the service.
The Bardon branch will permanently close on May 31st, leaving locals to choose between travelling to Maroochydore or braving the world of online banking.
I suppose they can do it online if they're able to.
Well, I think it's actually really quite difficult for a lot of older people to navigate the whole, internet banking.
If they get forced into digital banking, they are the #1 targets of the most sophisticated scammers in the world.
In a statement, CBA's Sunshine Coast area manager said the other 4 local branches already serve almost 2/3 of their Bardon customers.
People come here for a reason. We want our banking, we don't want to be part of online, and we don't want to be a cashless society either.
Danny Sharp, 7 News.
There you go. My office is starting to become famous. Now, anyway, just to make the point, we've changed their behaviour. We've forced them to modify their behaviour. We haven't changed their nature. That's why we need a public bank. But because of these other breaking issues, we're not going to talk about banking for the rest of this episode, because, we've got a lot of other things to cover. So let's get into it. All right, Richard. Evil regimes attempt to crush David McBride will backfire. And I call it the evil regime. Partly because of something you did last night. Richard did a presentation to our party on the history of the intelligence services in Australia, ASIO and ASIS. And you revealed something very interesting about ASIS, the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, that when it was set up, what it was intended to be, and it was not intended to be an Australian intelligence service, it was intended to be something much bigger. And they used a term. What was that term?
Said it was an empire agency, and that Robert Menzies had explicitly intended it to be to entrench and reinforce British power in the Asia-Pacific region.
And that's really struck me, this idea of it's an empire agency, because it actually still fundamentally is. What they call the Five Eyes is the secretive intelligence functions of an empire, not of a sovereign Australian nation. It's of an empire. And that empire for decades has been in its death throes, and what it's done is caused death and destruction everywhere through their regime change wars and their wars of provocation and such the sort of stuff they did in Iraq, etc. All done with this great moralising about how we're bringing democracy and freedom to the world. And of course, it was never true. And now, of course, when there is a real, and they're also protecting people from human rights atrocities. And now when there's a real case of that in Gaza, this same regime is supporting it. Oh, Israel has a right to defend itself. So the whole thing's a mess, but what they do is crush people who get in their way, and that's what they've tried to do this week to a genuinely heroic Australian, David McBride. And I feel so privileged that he got to sit there and I got to sit here, and he said to me, I'd like this to be a long interview. It's the longest interview I've ever done. I let him speak for 2 hours, and we'll put the link below if you haven't already seen it, for 2 hours on this platform, on the Citizens Insight series. So he could tell in detail his whole story, and he hasn't changed his story ever. So this week, on Tuesday, the Judge Mossop, sentenced David to 68 months in prison. That's 5 years and 8 months, with a non-parole period of 27 months. Now, the reason I described it earlier as crushing is because, well, for a couple of reasons. One is, in the context of what he did, so much of it has been vindicated.
Basically all of it now.
Well, exactly.
As of today.
As of today, so we'll talk about that in a minute, but there's breaking news today which has vindicated him even more. We'll talk about that in a minute, but they wouldn't have known about the war crimes if he hadn't have done it, right? And so that's why you've seen such a reaction. How come the first person to go to jail for war crimes is the whistleblower of the war crimes? And David says, and we'll play a video where you hear him saying it, he knows he's guilty. It was just a question of, given the circumstances, a reasonable judge would have given him a token sentence, right? Because if the opportunity wasn't available to him to absolve the guy, give him a token sentence. So that's one reason.
A jury of his peers probably would have thrown the whole thing out on
that's
the spot.
Remind me of that. We're going to come back to that. The other reason, though, is I went up there for it, and like I said, I spent the day with John Shipton, and I want to call out a big call out to Rain Sinclair, who is a big activist for Julian Assange and David McBride. And Rain is a tireless organiser, and she did brilliant work to get people to this event, and she's the one who basically persuaded me to go. We sat through the hearing, and the whole hearing was the judge reading his judgment. And they read every word of it. And frankly, it's its own form of excruciating torture. And David sat there very stoically the whole time with his eyes closed, absorbing this judgment of the judge. And this judge has a reputation of being particularly anal. And the reason why is he's repetitive, and he cites a million precedents and stuff like that because he's only concerned about his reputation to try and avoid getting appealed against, right? So he's got to look like he crosses every T and dots every I. What he did, though, in reading through this judgment, he kept coming back to this reference to 2 years, that 2 years sounded like a reasonable punishment for David, and he cited all these precedents of similar cases, and the common sentence there was around 2 years. Even though David technically faced 50 years or even an unlimited sentence under the area of law that he was in breach of, the judge ruled that out straight away, saying, look, that's just for the most extreme cases in the middle of a war, etc., where your genuine national security is at risk if secrets get out. So he ruled that out straight away. So he kept coming back to 2 years. And he also talked about at length the possibility of what they call an intensive corrections order, where David could have served house arrest.
House arrest and an ankle bracelet and all
that. Yeah, exactly, which would have been much more reasonable. And then he dropped a bomb. And the bomb was 68 months. So, because if it was 2 years, then the non-parole period would have been a few months, 3 to 6 months. But instead, 68 months with a non-parole period of 2 years and 3 months, and no intensive correction order, so it can be done in house arrest, and has to be served, in an actual prison with all the restrictions that brings on him. And the judge acknowledged that this would be just terrible on the family, which has already suffered a lot, etc. But none of that mattered. He had to give a tough sentence, and I'll get to that in a minute. Why he justified doing that. And I want to emphasise again, it wasn't a question of guilt. David pleaded guilty, but it was a question of, okay, given the circumstances, this guy doesn't deserve a tough sentence. on top of that, the judge acknowledged that David is a decent man and that he wasn't motivated by personal gain. And in making that acknowledgement, he went out of his way to say just nothing David did was justified. But by acknowledging that, he was quoting people from the army saying the same thing. That David had lots of character references throughout his whole career. By acknowledging that, he acknowledges the other side of that without saying so, which is if he's not motivated by personal gain, what's he motivated by? And I don't think people get this enough, Richard. He's a lawyer in a war zone, responsible for soldiers who every day we disagree with them being there, but you don't take away the courage of the person who's there, facing life and death decisions, facing live ammunition. And David is watching these guys having their lives destroyed because he got a whiff, hang on, something that had been done when I wasn't here, because he served two tours, and 2012 was the year of the killings. All the terrible war crimes you've heard about that we committed, shooting people with their hands tied behind their back and in handcuffs, kicking guys off cliffs to their deaths, slitting teenagers' throats, etc. That all happened when David wasn't there. And he knew something was wrong because he gets back there and morale is shot, and he sees that these soldiers that he's responsible for as their lawyer are being expected to conform to rules of engagement which are completely unreasonable. And because they can't, they are being pilloried and suddenly facing war crimes charges.
Yeah. And meanwhile, at the very same time, the people who committed the actual war crimes, the special crew in the SAS, are being protected and covered up for.
And he got a really strong sense of that, and he saw the documents that confirmed it, right? And he said, no way. And by his own account, what sparked him off was one of these soldiers who, in a struggle over a gun with an Afghan,
a Taliban guy.
A Taliban guy. Whoever gets the gun, whoever doesn't get the gun dies. He got the gun and shot the guy, and he's charged with a war crime. Whereas most Australians by now, if you haven't already seen it, you might have heard about it. There is actual footage that was broadcast on the ABC of a guy, an SAS guy, in the middle of a field with a teenage boy farmer, cowering on the ground below him, totally unarmed, totally defenceless, and because there was a body cam...
Lying on his back clutching prayer beads.
Lying on his back, and because there was a body cam on a fellow soldier, this was filmed, and that guy says, can I drop this guy or whatever, right?
Euphemism.
Yeah, and shot him in absolute cold blood. That's the sort of stuff that had been going on. That's the real war crimes, and what David was being confronted with was the opposite of that, right? And this soldier said to him, aren't you supposed to be doing something about this?
Yeah, he says, isn't it your job to stop the political bullshit? And he
Exactly.
said, yes, it is. And that was his path.
That was his turning point. That was his turning point, right? So when he's motivated by real world stuff. And what happened is, subsequently, is because life is never neat and tidy, it's always messy. And David's fight to get this out is messy. When they finally decided to throw the book at him, they could go back and look at all that mess and say, that was illegal, that was illegal, that was illegal. We have the grounds to throw the book at this guy, and that's what they did on Tuesday. Even though they acknowledged that's what he was motivated by. Now, the same judge, though, showed his true stripes in this ruling, but he also showed it previously, because this is the judge that actually... I would use the term rigged this outcome. The way he rigged this outcome is because of what he did back in November. Because he made two rulings. One was that a jury would not be allowed to hear David's overarching defence. And David's overarching defence was his oath is much bigger than just to follow orders. He has a responsibility to the people of Australia. That was his defence. And the judge said, no, you cannot use that.
Yeah, and a legal responsibility to his clients, his soldiers that he was responsible to represent as well.
But be clear, what he ruled is that couldn't be put to a jury. Now, because here's the thing, I had a big debate with someone the other day about this. We have a jury system in law for a reason. Juries are unqualified people. Judges and lawyers are qualified at law. They're unqualified. Why don't we just leave the law up to judges and lawyers? Why, going back to the Magna Carta, do we have juries? And even before the Magna Carta, of course. But the Magna Carta was the right to a jury, right? Why is that the case in our system? Because you can be absolutely correct at law and be totally wrong at life, at the human factor, right? At getting the reasonableness or unreasonableness of somebody's actions. And one of the most famous stories in the English literature by Shakespeare is The Merchant of Venice. In The Merchant of Venice, Shylock was 100% correct. The judge had to rule in his favour because he had a contract, right? He got the merchant to sign the contract that said, if I default on this debt, you get a pound of my flesh.
Nearest the heart.
Nearest the heart. And he was determined to extract his pound of flesh. And he had a contract, and the judge had to rule in his favour. But then she said, please show mercy. And he wouldn't show mercy. And so she said, well, okay, you have the right, take the knife and cut it. But if you cut 1 milligram more, or 1 ounce more, or 1 ounce less than a pound, you forfeit your life. You're in breach of your contract, you forfeit your life. And then he wanted to get out of it, right? And that was the judge using natural law against this guy. And so there's a reason Shakespeare wrote that story. So there's a reason you have juries. And a jury listening to David McBride saying, look, I have a duty to the people of Australia, not just to follow orders. A jury brought up in the post-World War II world where we're all taught about the Nazis as war criminals and the Nuremberg trials where the excuse of I was just following orders was not allowed. We've lived for 75, 80 years under the Nuremberg principle where that doesn't cut it. You have a conscience. If you see wrongdoing, you're supposed to disobey those orders. That judge trashed the whole thing. His actual quote was, in November, quote, there is no aspect of duty that allows the accused to act in the public interest contrary to a lawful military order. That's it. Our system, our war machine, our corrupted governments that wanted to punish this guy tore up the Nuremberg principle to do it. What more? That's why we're calling it the evil regime. Now, then the sentence, he had his justification for this particularly harsh sentence was revealing. There's essentially four factors. One, harm. He had to admit, though, Richard, that the harm was not to any individuals. Nobody suffered physically because of what David McBride did.
Nope.
The harm, the only harm he could cite, was reputational damage to Australia in the eyes of our partners, i.e. the Anglo-Americans, which may impact intelligence sharing. He was explicit about that. Because if we can't be seen to be keeping our dirty secrets locked away, then they might not share more intelligence with us. That's the harm.
Good.
In other words, he did harm to a secret of covering up, to the system of covering up lies and crimes. That's what he did harm to. The second factor in the harshness was no remorse. And anyway, David's proud of no remorse.
Yeah. Like
Right?
Why would you be expected to show remorse when you maintain you've done nothing wrong?
Exactly.
Even if it was technically illegal.
And we'll play the video in a minute where David, you can see himself, David shows no remorse. He did the right thing. He knows he did the right thing. The third and fourth were the most interesting, probably. First, deter others from copying David. And I was thinking more about this, and back after 9/11, when the terrorism stuff became a big thing, and the terrorism laws, and they're trying to condition us all about the danger of terrorism. A campaign, it was actually a global campaign. If you see something, say something.
Yeah, TV ads and all that.
Right?
Yeah.
Remember, if you see something, say something. Unless it's crimes by your government, then you're not allowed to say anything. Do not be a whistleblower like David McBride. That was his explicit reasoning for this harsh sentence. And the other one, which we can't say a lot about, but I want to say a little bit, deter David from revealing more stuff that he may know. Actually deter him still, despite everything that he's done. And the reason that is, I'm convinced, is because we know, we can't really say what it is, we know that ABC, when they got David McBride's documents and then they broke a story on war crimes, they sat on more than they broke. There's a lot of information in those documents that ABC suppressed. They did not want the public to know what David McBride was giving them to know. This is ABC functioning as state media. And this is also, Richard, why ABC tried to ambush David last month with that Four Corners story, to undermine his standing in the public, saying, oh, this guy didn't expose war crimes. Because what ABC can do is they'll do stories to punch down and expose individuals. Oh, that individual's a war crime, that individual's a war crime, let's win a Walkley Award for that. But they're not going to expose the system.
No, they're part of it.
They're part of it. They protected the system. He's trying to expose the system. ABC protected it. And then I have to say, I'm glad I was there, but it was a tough day because you sit through 2 hours of this excruciating judgment, and then he drops the bomb. And there was this delayed reaction in the court as it was sinking in what he'd actually said. And then this murmur turned into a chorus of voices. They just start shouting at the judge, shame, shame, calling out encouragement for David, but a lot of angry shouts directed at the judge. And at first the judge threatened to clear the court, and then he scarfed it out.
Cleared out himself.
He cleared out himself. I saw all these journos running around like headless chooks, trying to see what sort of soundbite they could get. David's number one supporter in the court was his ex-wife Sarah, and we'll put a link below to the Channel 10, the Project interview with her afterwards. We don't have time to play it here, but she's a rock. Clearly, Sarah's a rock. But she was distraught. She broke down crying. If you've seen photos of David or footage of David, he's always got a dog on a lead, his dog Jake, which is one of these support animals that he has. And so he had to say goodbye to Sarah and to Jake, and that was clearly a big deal. And he was over one side of a sort of a waist-high divide from the audience, and Sarah was sitting on the front line. And she's distraught, she's crying. A lot of his closest people were crying. But I tell you what, he stood tall. And anyway, I mean, it's one of those things where all right, like the guy was prepared for this, but still, it would have been really, really tough for him at the moment. But he stood tall. He comforted Sarah. He said goodbye to his dog, and he walked out of there. And he's taller than all the security guards and whatever who were ushering him out. And he stood tall and walked out of there standing tall. And then the most significant thing straight afterwards, Mark Davis announced, his lawyer announced an appeal on this question of the oath, the judge ruling out the possibility of a jury hearing that defence. Now, so that I can regain my composure, let's now play the video that was recorded by David just before, like the night before, in the likelihood that he would be sentenced and he wouldn't be able to record any more videos. So we'll just go to that now.
There we go.
All right, Dave, so this is a bit more of a sobering video. This is one we're recording in case the outcome isn't what we want it to be.
Former military lawyer David McBride has been sentenced to 5 years and 8 months jail in the ACT Supreme Court for sharing classified military documents with journalists.
It's titled, "If You're Watching This, I'm Going to Prison." But what would be your message to people in the instance where you have to go to prison?
If you're watching this, I'm in prison. Again, all I can do is thank the supporters. I'm not going to complain. I went into this with my eyes open. I always said I would go to prison with my head held up high, and it may be that I need to go to prison in order to fix this country. We need to look at how this country can pretend that I'm a national security threat when there are so many other things wrong with it. So much bribery, so much corruption, even war criminals that haven't been in jail, and leaders of our completely failed war effort, 20 years, $6 trillion, 41 good Australian soldiers dead, and no one has had to answer for it except for me, because I have damaged national security. I will sit in jail, I will get stronger in jail. We will build our forces. Plenty of people down through the ages have been in jail and have come out stronger, so don't worry about me. Maybe if you can, if you know my family, if you know my team, extend a helping hand, extend some love to my family. It won't be that easy for my girls, but they're strong girls. And when I tried to explain to them, or my ex-wife Sarah did, to say, you understand Dad might be going to jail, they were like, yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker, which I just love. They're not scared. They're a chip off the old block, and they are proud of me. Do not go silent until I'm out. I believe we'll win on an appeal. I believe the High Court will eventually have to say that we can't put people in jail for doing their jobs. I was a military lawyer. What do you think my job would be if not to pick up on potential illegal activity within the organisation that I was meant to police? I did my job. Put me in jail. My head will be held up high. I may have been a bit emotional when I was sentenced, but I can assure you, once the dust has settled and the exhaustion is gone, I will look back on this and be so grateful to everybody who supported it. And anyone who supported me, don't think this is a failure, this is a victory. We're going to win this, and when we do finally win it, it will be so, so fucking sweet.
And where down we go, 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 go.
First Australian to go to jail over the alleged war crimes in Afghanistan is the whistleblower that brought the allegations to the public's attention.
Well, there was quite a vocal reaction inside the courtroom from supporters sitting in the public gallery. The judge at one point suggested he might clear the gallery if they didn't quieten down.
McBride pleaded guilty to 3 charges, including theft and sharing more than 200 documents classified as secret with members of the press.
Mr McBride, of course, was taken away to jail, but...
He's on the duty of the Australian military officer. Effectively has one meaning, and that is to obey orders. Well, we fundamentally disagree with that.
Good on you, mate. I know you've got this. The truth's got to be on your side. One-term elbow. Dreyfus a disgrace. We got your back, mate, and thank you for your service. Good luck, mate.
The thought that there is no legal duty, public interest duty, when you're a member of the armed forces, I think should cause all of us to take stock about what are the protections here for the public interest when it comes to Australia's military and any future overseas deployment.
Today, I serve my country. And the question I have for you, Anthony Albanese, is who do you serve?
So, I mean, there you go. I mean, that is the nature of the guy. I can tell you it was tougher. He was very brave in that video. It was clearly tougher for him on the day, especially in the morning, but that was him all along. That was him sitting here. That was him when I first met him. He knew what he'd done. He wanted to put the system on trial, and he said to me, if that means going to jail, so be it, right? It's just that despite what he said there, the sentence was tough because of the expectations that had been raised that it would be something much more minor and something that would be easier for his daughters, etc., to handle. Now, that ended to be continued. We've already got the continuation. It's already breaking news. So chip in here with what you know, because we've only been able to look at the sort of the broad brushstrokes of this, Richard. But on that evening, the budget night, which was the Tuesday, the 14th, the government finally released to Senator Malcolm Roberts, who had asked for it in Senate estimates, a report, an oversight report about David's case that the government had been sitting on since the 8th of November. And this was a report which was an oversight of the Barwick report. And in the Barwick report, the Barwick report had vindicated David on the question of war crimes, and it said, look, these are the allegations of war crimes, and they hold up. We know these people need to be held accountable. But that actually said the top brass weren't accountable, right?
Yeah, it claimed implausibly that, oh, well, they didn't know what was going on. It only went up to a certain level and that. And so this external committee reviewing that and implementations for the recommendation just said, no, that's not good enough.
Yeah. So that's the point. Now, what they're saying is, this oversight report, which included Vivian Tom, who was the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, they're saying, no, the generals must be held accountable. That's David's whole message. In fact, they put out a poster last week that the McBride campaign called Wanted for Hunting Generals. That was his whole point. So he's now been doubly vindicated. The existence of the war crimes and him saying, look, you can't just blame the grunts. This goes to the top. You've got to hold them accountable. And now, and the worst part is the government got this on the 8th of November, which was either the day of or the week before his trial, his main trial. The cover letter, we'll put the cover letter on the screen. The cover letter that came with this said from these three people on the Oversight Committee, there's no need to keep this report that we've given you now from the public. Instead, the government kept it from the public. They did not let this fact that this Oversight Committee has vindicated David again be part of the general reporting of this issue so that would influence the trial and the sentencing. Because there's no way it wouldn't have, right? You know, if he got 58 months despite being vindicated, imagine if it was doubly vindicated, right? The judge would have had a much harder time to throw the book at the guy. And there's going to be, we'll report this in more detail next week, but a lot more is going to come out about that and the way this trial was run. And that'll be interesting to see how the appeal goes. But this is a moment of truth for the Australian people. Will we bow to this evil regime, or will we take our country back? Because the problem in society is you get desensitized and demoralized to evil and by evil. And so you assume it's going to happen, and when it happens, you're never surprised. But because you're in that frame of mind, you never think that you have a responsibility to do something about it. But how much more is it going to take? We've been in non-stop wars for over 20 years because we're tied to this evil regime. We have the blood of literally millions of people around places like the Middle East on our hands because we're tied to this evil regime. So much evil's been perpetrated in our name because of that. And now some of the most prominent people in we've got these cases in our country, Julian Assange, David McBride, and Dan Duggan, that being absolutely tortured psychologically in public to send us a message to stay in our place. Are we going to be defined by that? Are we going to bow to this evil regime? And on that note, I thank Noeline Isherwood for this because she read it out yesterday, but I think it's an excellent story to end on, because there's the story of Willem Tell in Swiss history is a very inspiring one. Because in Switzerland, which was all these independent cantons in the mountains, they were occupied by the Austrians. And the Austrians were this brutal empire from next door. And there was this particularly bizarre thing where the Austrian governor put a hat on a pole and he required everyone in Switzerland to bow to the hat to show that they were submissive to the empire, to the Austrians. And William Tell came to town with his son and he didn't bow to the hat. And when he was caught and arrested for not bowing to the hat, the particular law figure, Gessler, I think his name was a rather cruel person. And he made William Tell take out his bow and arrow and shoot an apple off his son's head And William Tell did. And famously in the story, William Tell shoots the apple off his son's head. But Gessler, I think I've got that name right, noticed that William Tell had taken out 2 arrows. And he said, what's the second arrow for? He said, that's for your heart if I had missed the apple. And then, arrest the guy. And so William Tell runs off, and there's a whole chase to get William Tell. But what that incident does is it sparks a rebellion among the Swiss. And the Swiss, from that becomes the spark that leads to this fire that races across Switzerland and leads to their uprising against the Austrians, where they win their independence. And in the play of this by the German playwright Friedrich Schiller, there's a scene where the main resistance leaders are in the Ruetli Forest, and they swear an oath, and it's called the Ruetli Oath. And the oath, this is what it says, the Ruetli Oath. I'll get the producer to put the words on the screen. No, there is a limit to the tyrant's power. When the oppressed can find no justice, when the burden grows unbearable, he reaches with hopeful courage up into the heavens and seizes hither his eternal rights, which hang above, inalienable and indestructible as stars themselves. The primal state of nature reappears, where man stands opposite his fellow man. As a last resort, when not other means is of avail, the sword is given him, the highest of all goods we may defend from violence. Thus stand we before our country, thus stand we before our wives and before our children. We will become a single land of brothers, nor shall we part in danger and distress. We shall be free, just as our fathers were, and sooner die than live in slavery. We shall rely upon the highest God, and we shall never fear the might of men. That's the Ruetli Oath. And may this extraordinary Australian's courage, David McBride, because he was prepared to do this, may this be the spark that actually gets Australians to rally against this kind of evil regime corruption that we've become conditioned to for so long. All right, on that note, let's move on to the next episode, Richard, because this is your time to shine. We've left a little bit of time so Richard can explain this in the detail it requires. Yellow Peril in the Yellow Sea. And this is about this other incident that's, because there's a few incidents that sort of semi-regularly happen between Australia and China lately, in the Yellow Sea. And first of all, most people probably had to look up where the Yellow Sea was, because we're usually talking about the South China Sea, right? And the Yellow Sea is like this cul-de-sac between China and the Koreas. And so a lot of people who don't get bogged down into the legalities of this would have thought naturally, well, why are we there? Right? Why are we there? Like, someone did a map that showed that the incident was 8,500 kilometres from Canberra, but it's like a couple of hundred kilometres from Beijing, right? Yet we are there in China's face, and the question is why? What, you have an incident, yeah, we make it sound bad. Oh, our pilots, we'll put at risk of whatever.
Unsafe and unprofessional.
Unsafe and unprofessional.
Risked our lives of our brave servicemen over there.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the question is, why are we there? And most reasonable people will think, well, hang on, if we're just going to go around and get up in China's face, we're looking for trouble. Seriously, what do we expect? But there was an explanation. We said we're enforcing UN sanctions against North Korea, so we are morally justified to be there. It's 100% legitimate. We're justified being in China's face. Not so fast. So, Richard, what's the real story?
Okay, so Defence put out this statement on the 4th of May about this unsafe and unprofessional conduct by a Chinese fighter jet that had buzzed an Australian Navy Seahawk helicopter that was busy enforcing UN sanctions. It says part of the international effort. Take note, the definite article, the international effort to enforce sanctions on
as in
UN,
the one and only.
UN Security Council sanctions on North Korea. No. This is they call it Operation Argos, after the all-seeing watchman of Greek myth, the giant Argos Panoptes, right? So, not pretentious at all. But
there's a bit of a pattern of such pretension in this party, I can tell you.
So what this thing actually is a US 2019. It started under the Trump administration, the China hawks, to use the pretext of enforcing UN Security Council sanctions on North Korea to get up and, as you said, get in China's face, sail their warships right up to the 12 nautical mile territorial limit.
Yep.
And they're going up and down. They're dropping these sonar buoys that monitor for submarines, and monitor shipping traffic in and out of China.
What's that got to do with UN sanctions? Nothing.
Yeah, nothing at all. And so you go looking for, and the media reporting on all this, I don't know if it's because they've just been told what to say or if they're just really bad at their jobs or both. But everybody's talking about this thing as though they just accept it at face value. Even some of the better journalists are saying, like what we said, what are we even doing there? There is no UN mandate for this, none. There are UN sanctions, but the actual mechanism for policing them is a UN Security Council subcommittee that makes all its decisions by consensus of all 15 members, of which China is one of the 5 permanent.
Right.
The P5 members of the Security Council. Hands up who thinks they authorised the Americans to be traipsing about on the border of on the limit of their territorial waters inside their exclusive economic zone.
Yeah.
What the UN sanctions, this is a resolution from 2006. It relates to, the sanctions are specific to North Korea's ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons programs. And they've completely failed. I mean, they've successfully developed
They've got a nuclear weapon now.
Nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver them.
Yeah.
So there's not really any more point in maintaining these things, but they are still in force. But each country is responsible for policing compliance by its own vessels flagged in its own country, and or cargoes originating from its ports. But the UN, you can find the website that lays out how this all works. Your interception, interdiction, inspection of cargoes is only allowed in your own ports and territorial waters, not somebody else's.
So yes, as UN sanctions, we, Australia, have a responsibility to help enforce them, but in our territory. Not up there in the LOC, here.
And so the correct procedure would be if you go, hey, we've belatedly found out that there's this ship that we think has illicit cargoes bound for North Korea, you would notify China via that subcommittee of the Security Council, and they would deal with it. And they have been dealing with it. They were, they're permanent member of the Security Council, as is Russia. They imposed these sanctions, right? They agreed to this. They've been complying.
So if it's not the UN mandate, it's this US, is it the 7th Fleet?
Yeah, the US 7th Fleet runs this operation out of its one of its bases in occupied Japan. Am I allowed to call it that? That's what it is. Yokosuka, I think it's called, US Navy base. And it's got all its little obedient lackeys over there. Australia, New Zealand's been part of it at various times. France, the UK, of course, they're always there with bells on anywhere they can make trouble.
So it's the gang.
It's the usual gang. It's the rules-based order. It's the, we make the rules and you follow orders.
Or my new term today, it's the evil regime.
Yeah. And so they're pretending to have a UN mandate that never existed for anybody to go and drop, go and monitor Chinese naval movements, go and intercept signals with these, because that's what these warships do. If you hear air warfare destroyer, this is what they used to call the Aegis combat system. It's all to do with mapping out and working out ways to infiltrate, to get past, to penetrate coastal defences so that we can nuke China if we decide to, or the Americans can and we'll help. That's what this is for. That's what these operations are. And this all came out a couple of years ago. There's a publication that most people probably know called Crikey. And there was an article there by their politics editor, Bernard Keane, co-authored with Professor Clinton Fernandez of the University of New South Wales. He's an historian, an ex-military signals intelligence officer, saying, yeah, this is what we're doing in the South China Sea, and of course now with this other thing up in the Yellow Sea as well.
Now there's a much more interesting actual motivation here that I want to get onto, but before we do, let's just put to bed the supposedly dangerous part of this incident, because well, anyway, you give the details of how the flares were deployed and you know, how dangerous was it really?
You know, we've all seen the movies, right? They drop these flares, whether for evasive measures, but the whole point is you just drop them and they just hang in the air.
Yeah.
They said it was 300 metres in front and 60 metres above of this helicopter when it was heading towards, this is what the Australian government says, you know, Richard Marles said in an interview, that's how he described it. Well, if that helicopter, even if it's heading at maximum speed in that direction where the flares are dropped, it's still got more than 3 seconds to change course. And the thing, they're not coming at it, they just drop these flares and they just hang there, right? They just drift down, that's what they do.
So 3 seconds to change course.
Yeah, and so anybody can do, I mean, if you qualified for a driver's license, you know, let alone the reflexes of a combat pilot and the amount of training they have, you know, where you react before you even consciously know what you're doing. That's how much they train these guys in these evasive manoeuvres.
And that's assuming they were going at full speed.
Yeah, which the Chinese version of events, which is you know, in the absence of a plausible one from Australia, then theirs is really the only story standing. They said, well, this helicopter had been deployed 3 times off the landing deck of the HMAS Hobart, this destroyer, coming right up to the territorial limit, inside of which the Chinese Navy were holding an exercise in their own territorial waters that are sovereign territory that you may not enter without permission.
Yeah.
On the third, they said they called them on the radio, said, you know, warned them off the first 2 times. The third time they said, okay, enough of this, and they sent out an interceptor to chase them away. And there was no danger. There's nothing. I mean, even the Australian military said, you know, there was nothing was damaged, no harm was done to anybody.
Yeah. All right. So, tell us about the exclusive economic zone question and why there's actually, this is a bit of a there's a backstory debate here that's playing out on this incident.
Exclusive economic zone. So territorial seas, sovereign waters, 12 nautical miles. I forget how many kilometres that is, but a nautical mile is a bit more than a land mile for whatever reason.
It's a mile over the Great Circle of the Earth, because the Earth is actually round, not flat.
Oh, yeah.
So
I keep forgetting
because it's
about
a curved mile, that's why it's longer than a flat mile.
So anyway, 12 nautical miles is the territorial limit. 200 nautical miles is the exclusive economic zone. In the absence of a competing claim where there's, you know, like littoral states with overlapping borders, distance is you know, closed. So they negotiate that between themselves and settle their borders and all of that. Now, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea from 1982, that the Americans are the only major maritime power not to ratify it. They signed it and then they never ratified it. The Chinese have, as have India, you know, the Philippines, Indonesia. We're supposed to comply with this now. Exclusive economic zones, foreign military vessels have right of what's called innocent passage, so they just go through on their way to somewhere, and even transit passage during wartime under strict conditions through territorial seas, let alone economic zones. But it doesn't say anything about military exercises. So, of course, the position is, well, if it's not allowed by the law, you shouldn't be doing it, whereas the American position is, one, we haven't ratified your law anyway, so big middle finger, but they pretend to observe the conditions of it when it suits them, but they say, basically, anything that's not explicitly prohibited is allowed, at least to us. If you do it, you're the bad guy. When we do it, it's democracy and freedom and all of that jazz.
So the Indians, the Indonesians and the Philippines actually all say that exclusive economic zones should not have any military activity in them at all.
Without the permission of the state whose zone it is.
And the Chinese say the same thing.
Yeah, there are 20 countries, and I can't list them all off the top of my head, but China and India. The three countries that we're trying to get on our side to take on China agree with China's position.
So even the Philippines agrees with China's position on this,
Yeah.
and they're at loggerheads with them at the moment. Even they agree with China's position on this. But a year or two ago, the Chinese came down to Australia's waters and actually came inside our EEZ, and they said to us, well, we're just trying to show you a point here.
Yeah, they come about a mile inside just to make the point, and they just hung around out there. And everybody, you know, James Patterson and Andrew Hastie and Peter Dutton and all of the other lunatics, all yelling and carrying on about it.
So they're screaming, oh, they're inside our EEZ. So China said, well, whose side of the debate are you on?
Yeah.
We want a rule that says no military activity inside EEZs, but the Americans don't want that rule. Whose side are you on?
Yeah, and the head of the Navy, I forget his name, but he had to come out and calm everything down, saying, look, we know they're there. We do the same thing to them. There's no problem here.
And
right, so
and because I've got this quote, I want to read it out and you can comment on it. But the actual reason the Americans don't want this rule is because if they are not allowed to do military activity inside exclusive economic zones, one of their people, Judge Advocate Professor Peter Dutton, that's his name.
Yeah, Professor Peter Dutton of the US Naval War College, former Judge Advocate.
He said, if it accepted the position of China, India, the Philippines and Indonesia on EEZs, the US would be forced to conduct military operations from more than 200 miles offshore. Quote, that would significantly reduce the range of US sensors and missiles, making intelligence gathering much harder and making it more difficult to deploy US Marines and their equipment in amphibious assaults. America's ability to project naval and air power would face limitations not only in the South China Sea, but also in other EEZs such as the Persian Gulf. Its ability to use the world's oceans as a medium of manoeuvre and global power projection would be threatened.
Now that's a paraphrase of a longer address that he gave, but that is what he said.
Yeah.
Just not quite a direct quote, excuse me. So that's the issue. Always has been, and we're, as Clinton Fernandez, you know, dubbed Australia in a book a couple of years ago, sub-imperial power. Right? These people who are running this country these days see the whole raison d'etre. Australia's national interest is whatever pleases the Americans and the British, and keeps us in good with our partners, including crucifying whistleblowers like David McBride.
Exactly. And so we could have a more peaceful world if we align with these countries like China, India, the Philippines and Indonesia who say, look, let's just keep all military activity outside of EEZs, but we're aligning with the Americans because the Americans say, hang on, we want to be able to spy on countries, and if we can't do it inside the 200 miles, we won't be able to do it effectively. And then China's the bad guy for saying to us, get lost. Now, so let's finish on this. Richard, thanks very much for that. I just want to remind people again about the Daniel Duggan thing because I'm about to go and do another interview on that. We will put the link below. The breaking news on Daniel Duggan is that because he faces his extradition hearing, he's an Australian now. They want to extradite him, the US extraterritorial reach. They want to extradite him to the United States and throw the book at him. Is that his time in China, he was in contact with ASIO and US intelligence. But because he's saying they wanted him to spy for them. Because they do. Yeah. There's a lot of cases lately where we're told, oh, look, China's arrested these people who are our people and they're innocent. How dare China arrest them? But when they actually come to real light, it turns out they were spies. And the Duggan case, another case where he was being set up to spy and he didn't play ball. And now he's being punished, and it looks like he's being punished for that. There's other aspects of the case, but that's a big one. It's the same system. These are the people who've got us into permanent wars, and they're crushing people to make examples of them, like Daniel Duggan, David McBride and Julian Assange. We have to make a stand, people. So stick with the Citizens Party. We'll report more next week in a lot of detail on the banking inquiry, right? So look forward to that. But help us fight this evil regime and take our country back. Richard, thanks very much.
Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks to the viewer for tuning in. Tune in next week for more.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.